Hi, my name is Albert Burnham, one of the pastors at Unalaska Reformed Church. We would like to thank you for tuning into this broadcast of the Unalaska Reformed Church service. However, we would like to remind viewers that watching a service on TV can never replace the imperative to believers to participate in a local church, and we would love to invite you to join us for our Sunday morning service when this time of precaution has ended.
Again, our text is Philippians chapter 4, there in verses 4 through 7. Albert preached on this text a couple of years ago, and given the current situation and our circumstances today, I thought it was a good time to bring that text up again, particularly because of its relevance. So if you'd read with me there again in Philippians 4 through 7, we'll just read again together. Paul writes to the church in Philippi, he says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I will say, rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." So as I said, in light of our current circumstances, particularly with the spread of the coronavirus, the fear that's associated with it, I want to take some time to think about these things together, particularly in light of what the Scriptures teach us, what the Scriptures say. It doesn't take but a few minutes of watching the news or reading an article to see how many millions of people around the world are captivated with a very, very strong sense of fear. And even many of you may be experiencing that fear also. So it's important that as Christians in particular, we take a step back, and consider these current events, these current circumstances from a biblical perspective. It's important for us to see the world from a biblical perspective or from a heavenly perspective. It was just a few weeks ago while we were working through the book of Matthew in chapter 16 that we witnessed Jesus' rebuke of Peter, his disciple Peter, who would become an apostle of Jesus. That we witnessed Peter when he told Jesus that they would not let him suffer and die in Jerusalem. Jesus was going to say, now as the Messiah, as the Christ, Peter had given his famous confession that you are the Christ, and I must go to Jerusalem, I must go to Judea to suffer and to die and to be resurrected. And Peter says, "Far be it from you, Lord, for these things to happen to you, for you to suffer and die in Jerusalem." And Jesus responds, "Peter, get behind me, Satan. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." It was Matthew 16:23. Peter could only see Jesus' death as defeat. Peter could only see Jesus in that particular context, Jesus' death as defeat. He couldn't see how Jesus' death would ultimately be or would lead to triumph. Peter was setting his mind, as Jesus says to him in that chapter. Peter was setting his mind on things and the things of man and not on the things of God. And likewise, we should also seek to see our current earthly circumstances in light of God's heavenly perspective, in light of God's purposes, in light of God's plans. From a humanly perspective, it's easy to see only death, ruin, and reason for despair. Whether that's due to the bodily harm of what a new virus might do to us or to our families, or what the effects of this virus might have on our economy, whether we will have enough money to pay rent, whether we might lose our jobs, whether we might lose our retirement as the stock market takes a dive. From a humanly perspective, and this is important for us to realize, from a humanly perspective, there are countless reasons to have fear. from a humanly perspective, there are countless reasons to have fear. But today I want us to take a long look at the Scriptures so that we might see our lives and our world from a heavenly perspective. Proverbs 12:25 says, "Anxiety in a man's heart weighs him down, but a good word makes him glad." Psalm 94:19 says, "When the cares of my heart are many," that is, the anxieties of my heart are many, "your consolations, they are comforting, cheers my soul." So my hope this morning is that we might first see the dangers of seeing our circumstance only from a humanly perspective. And second, to take a great comfort in light of what God teaches us in His Word, despite the worst of earthly circumstances. This text from the book of Philippians is fitting, obviously, for more ways than one for our subject today. Not only do these 4 verses get at the heart of what we want to consider, but the Apostle Paul, who wrote this letter, writes these things, and this is important to realize. This setting is important. Paul writes these very verses, this entire letter, while he is in prison, while he is in chains, while he is under arrest. He writes these 4 verses in the context of being imprisoned by the Roman Empire. So he's not saying what he says here from a position of comfortable or ideal earthly circumstances. He tells the church in Philippi to rejoice in the Lord always and not to be anxious about anything while, key word, while in prison. While he's in prison. The implications here are clear. Earthly circumstances should never dictate our joy. Earthly circumstances should never dictate our joy as Christians. And earthly circumstances should never cause us to become anxious about anything. Our earthly circumstances should never cause us to become anxious about anything. In the Bible, there are 2 senses used for this word, often translated anxiety, that we read here as anxious. The first sense is an anxiety that's associated with a loving concern for others. The first sense is that of a definition, if you will, that's associated with having a loving concern for others. For example, in 1 Corinthians 12:24 through 25, the Apostle Paul is talking about the body and the members that make up that body. And he says this, "God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care." There's that word. It's the same Greek word that undergirds, or that is translated care, for one another. Even here in Philippians, back in chapter 2, verses 19 and 20, Paul writes, quote, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon. This is a brother in Christ, and that he wants to send Timothy to them, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned. There's that word, translated concerned for your welfare. So there is, in a sense, which we ought to care for and be concerned for one another, out of love for one another. However, the second sense of this word, often translated anxiety, is rooted in unbelief. And that's central to what we're looking at today, is that this word anxiety is, in this sense, rooted in unbelief. Rooted in a lack of trust and faith and hope in our God. It's not a commendable attribute. In fact, because this type of anxiety is rooted in unbelief, it is sinful. This type of anxiety is sinful. This anxiety is, in essence, a lack of faith or a lack of trusting in God. Anxiety, if you were to look it up, is defined as an uneasy feeling of uncertainty. It's agitation, dread, or fear. Anxiety is defined as the uneasy feeling of uncertainty, agitation, dread, or fear. And we typically become anxious when our circumstances threaten us or disrupt our lives. Whether it be our finances, our routines, our health, our jobs, our relationships to one another, our passions or our desires, our plans, the list goes on. And these unbiblical fears, this anxiety, is usually symptomatic of a more deeply rooted sin, as I've pointed out. For instance, an unbiblical fear of death may be symptomatic of our holding too tightly to this life. Our fears may indicate that our treasure is not in heaven. Our fears may indicate that we're looking to our circumstances to find peace, not God. Our fears may indicate that we're trying to control what we cannot and not trusting in our Lord. Our fears may indicate that our will is not submitted to God's, believing that God must not be concerned with my welfare if He isn't doing things my way. Our fears usually indicate that we lack an eternal perspective of our circumstances. That's, again, like I've said, we want to have an eternal or a heavenly perspective of our earthly circumstances. And usually our worrying is some combination of all of these things that I've mentioned, all of which rooted in unbelief. So when we're threatened with an epidemic like this coronavirus, we can easily become acutely aware of our unbelief, of the unbelief that is in our lives. Our fears rise to the surface, and we're robbed of our joy and our peace, and instead we're fraught, riddled with fear. All kinds of fears. All of a sudden, Paul's command to rejoice always and to do not be anxious about anything go out the window, don't they? It's almost as if we behave like there's an implied condition in his command. Rejoice always in the Lord and do not be anxious about anything unless there's good reason to fear. That's how we behave. We behave as if Paul had said that. But Paul doesn't add that qualifier. Instead, Paul tells the church in Philippi to, quote, rejoice in the Lord while he's in prison, and do not be anxious about anything while he's in prison. While his circumstances from an earthly perspective are dire and uncertain. He assumes that our lives as Christians will be different than that of those in the world, and that of those who are unbelievers. And he's right, our lives should. Our lives ought to look different. We shouldn't be gripped with fear in the face of death. We shouldn't be paralyzed with anxiety when faced with terrifying and uncertain circumstances. And this is important. We looked at this a few weeks ago. Self-preservation is not a hallmark of the Christian life. Self-preservation is not a hallmark of the Christian life. It's not what marks us. Instead, we're called to be a living sacrifice, to love our neighbors as ourself, to be willing to pick up our cross, as we saw several weeks ago in Matthew. To pick up our cross and follow Jesus, willing even to lose our lives. This is what it means to pick up our cross, to be willing to die for the sake of Jesus like that. We're willing to follow him that far. Let's be clear. Epidemics like this are not unprecedented. Epidemics like this are not unprecedented. In fact, in many respects, the epidemics and plagues that have come before us have been far worse. Now, don't hear me say this. I don't say that to minimize the current threat. I do not say that to minimize the current threat. In fact, I say that to highlight how the church has responded throughout the ages to crises just like this. One writer, Moses Lee, recently from the Gospel Coalition, wrote this in an article. He said, this will be a little bit lengthy, so hang in there with me. I think you will find this helpful. In AD 249 to 262, Western civilization was devastated by one of the deadliest pandemics in history. Though the exact cause of the plague is uncertain, The city of Rome was said to have lost an estimated 5,000 people a day. The city of Rome. At the height of the outbreak, one eyewitness bishop, Dionysius of Alexandria, wrote that although the plague did not discriminate between Christians and non-Christians, quote, its full impact seemed to fall on the non-Christians. Having noted the difference between the Christian and non-Christian responses to the plague, he says of the non-Christians in Alexandria, this is what the bishop wrote, quote, at the first onset of the disease, they pushed the sufferers away and fled from their dearest, throwing them into the roads before they were dead and treating unburied corpses as dirt, hoping thereby to avert the spread and contagion of the fatal disease. But do what they might, they found it difficult to escape, end quote. Moses goes on in his article. He says, non-Christian accounts confirm this sentiment. A century later, the emperor Julian attempted to curb the growth of Christianity after the plague. One of the things, the Christian response to this plague was vastly different. And because of their response, the Christian church began to grow in number. Many were converted to Christianity because of the compassion shown by the Christians. And so 100 years later, Moses writes, Emperor Julian attempted to curb the growth of Christianity after the plague by leading a campaign to establish pagan charities. That mirrored the work of Christians in his realm. In AD 362, in a letter, Julian complained that the Hellenists needed to match the Christians in virtue, blaming the recent growth of Christianity on their, quote, benevolence to strangers, their care for the graves of the dead, and the pretended holiness of their lives, end quote. Elsewhere he wrote, quote, for it is a disgrace that the impious Christians support not only their own poor, but ours as well, end quote. So though Julian questioned the motives of Christians, his embarrassment over Hellenistic charities confirm pagan efforts, or that pagan efforts fell massively short of Christian standards of serving the sick and poor, especially during epidemics. So if the non-Christian response to the plague could be characterized as self-preservation, avoiding the sick at all costs, the Christian response was the opposite. Many of the Christians set an example of self-sacrifice and a willingness to put their own lives at risk to love their neighbor. Bishop Dionysius would also write during the plague between 249 and 262, quote, most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of the danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy. Does that remind you of what Paul says in Philippians? Rejoice in the Lord always. They were not robbed of joy during this plague. He goes on, for they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. And Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage at that time, wrote to the church and said this, there is nothing remarkable in cherishing merely our own people. This was an admonition to the church, and he said that there is nothing remarkable in cherishing merely our own people with the due attentions of love, but that one might become perfect who should do something more than the heathen man or publicans, one who, overcoming evil with good and practicing a merciful kindness like that of God, should love his enemies as well. Thus the good was done to all men, he said, not merely to the household of faith. And later in the 14th century, we could list a multitude of things, and I'm only going to focus on a couple. In the 14th century, that is the 1300s, the Black Death haunted Europe. In only 5 years, the plague had wiped out nearly half of Europe's population. In only 5 short years, this plague that had haunted Europe for more than a century wiped out half of Europe's population. And for centuries later, the plague would return again and again. So in 1527, it struck Wittenberg, where Protestant reformer Martin Luther and his wife Katharina lived. While many fled the city, they stayed to care for the sick. When we read records like these, we should ask ourselves, how was it that these Christians were able to respond in this way? How were they able to respond with such courage and with such self-sacrificial love toward their neighbors in the face of danger? Why were they not overrun by their own fear? Well, the answer to that question, I think, is relatively simple. Their joy, their peace was not grounded in their earthly circumstances. They were not tossed to and fro by their earthly circumstances. In other words, the condition of their circumstances did not dictate whether or not they had joy or didn't have joy. It didn't dictate whether they had peace or didn't have peace. Instead, their joy and their peace was anchored somewhere else. It was anchored in God. It was anchored in their Lord by their faith. No matter what, they could face the most dire of circumstances because they had a robust hope in the face of death. You see, our faith acts as an anchor to our soul. Without it, we will quickly become swamped. Think about this in your mind. Without that anchor, we would otherwise become quickly swamped by the waves of adversity, dashed against the rocks of our own fears. Without an anchor, we will not have peace. Without an anchor, we will not have joy. We'll be plagued by fear and destined for ruin, just like a ship without an anchor. Whereas if we're anchored by our faith in God, we will have hope. And we will have peace no matter the circumstances. Now that's the hallmark of a Christian. That's the hallmark of a follower of Christ. Now that doesn't mean we will escape adversity. Let me be clear. Many false teachers claim this. But this does not mean we will escape adversity. This does not mean we won't be affected by the sufferings of this world. Many of those Christians who risked their lives to take care of the sick over the centuries during various plagues and epidemics lost their lives with the patients, lost their lives with their neighbors. But it does mean we will not be moved like a ship with an anchor that will hold. Our anchor will hold. Death will not win, and that we will be able to rejoice in the Lord in all our circumstances, and to not have to be anxious about anything. That is a wonderful gift, that we do not have to be anxious about anything. We can have what Paul talks about there in verse 7, the peace of God which surpasses all understanding. As Christians, that is something that we have that the world does not have. It's why we ought to want to share the gospel, so that others might have that anchor as well, that they might have such a peace. And remember that God is at work even in the midst of our dire circumstances. This is also another important point. To remember that these circumstances are not random. They're not outside the providential hand or the good providential hand of God. That He is at work even in our dire earthly circumstances. For all earth, and this is important, for all earthly circumstances serve God's purposes. Remember that. All earthly circumstances serve God's purposes. And God works all things for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. This is why Christians can be the most bold and compassionate people on earth. This is why followers of Christ should be the most bold and compassionate people on earth. Because Christ is our anchor, and we're not dashed against the rocks of every earthly circumstances. Therefore, if we trust in our God, we can weather any circumstance, any storm, knowing that all circumstances serve Him. That's the heavenly perspective. This truth should be a massive stabilizing force for the Christian life, an anchor that never breaks loose, or a ballast that cannot be overthrown. The ballast is that weight the bottom of a boat, or sometimes hangs below that of a sailboat, so that in the worst of storms, that boat cannot be tipped. It cannot be overturned. Now you might ask, how do I do this? I am anxious. How do I put this into practice? How do I stop being anxious? How do I stop being fearful? I get it. I see the heavenly perspective, but I still feel anxious. How do I stop fearing things that I shouldn't fear? Well, I think there are at least two answers to that question. The first is what I just described. Remind yourself daily that all earthly circumstances serve God's purpose. Remind yourself of that truth. And that all circumstances are intended for your good. Not only does God have control, does He ordain, does He oversee all of the earthly circumstances, but that He cares for you, that He intends, and He will work all of those things for your good. This is essentially Romans 8:28, isn't it? For God causes all things to work for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. That should change your life. I can't emphasize this truth enough. This text is one of the most awe-inspiring texts in all of the Bible. God's sovereignty is displayed here. God's providence over His creation is displayed here in all circumstances. And God's loving care toward His children is displayed here. All in one verse. Meditate on this text. Preach it to yourself in every circumstance. Write it on your forehead. Write it in your heart. Memorize it. This text gives us a heavenly perspective of earthly circumstances. And second, do what Paul says here in Philippians 4:6. He says, do not be anxious about anything. Then he goes on and he says, but in everything, by prayer and supplication. That means begging when he says supplication. Prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be known to God. I've said this before, but if you struggle especially with worry and anxiety, then this is your how-to verse. You should be praying as often as you worry. Every moment of the day that you catch yourself worrying, you pray. You cast all of your cares upon Him because He cares for you. The moment you catch yourself becoming fearful and anxious over your earthly circumstances, then pray. Bring all of it in prayer and begging and supplication before God. Make known to Him what you're worried about. All of it. Why? Because He cares for you. I just quoted there, 1 Peter 5:6 and 7. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time He may exalt you, casting all your cares upon Him, all your anxieties on Him, because He cares for you. Psalm 55:22 says, cast your burden on the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. Remember that unmovable anchor. God's caring for you is the reason, it's the grounds you can find relief from your anxiety. And it's the reason you can have peace, a peace that surpasses all understanding, a peace that the world cannot achieve apart from their Creator. When you pray and let all of your requests be known to Him, you're letting go of a burden you cannot carry. You're entrusting these things to God. It's a very practical thing to do. You see, prayer is not so much about changing or at all changing God's will. It's about our will becoming submitted and conformed to His will. That's why when we read the Lord's Prayer, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that is all about us being conformed to His will. Prayer is about our wills becoming conformed to His will, not the other way around. Psalm 94:19 says, when the cares of my heart are many, your comfort, your consolations cheer my soul. We are intended to guard our hearts and our minds with prayer, as Paul says there. This is how we guard our hearts and our minds. It's with prayer. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, for those of us who maybe don't feel the anxiety that others may feel regularly, on the other end of the spectrum, because of the surety of our anchor in Christ, some of us are prone to live recklessly, or to put it another way, to take our circumstances lightly. This is the other end of the spectrum. To take our circumstances, our earthly circumstances, lightly. Make no mistake, though our anchor will hold, the dire circumstances of this world ought not to be taken lightly. Our faith should not make us cavalier or trivialize our circumstances or the danger of our circumstances. In the same way that our circumstances should not cause us to despair, our certainty of faith should not cause us to trivialize the real dangers of our circumstances. We should not take our circumstances lightly. When the tsunami sirens go and you're near the beach, you get in your van and you drive up the mountain. When the coronavirus and the government is doing their best to give us guidelines so as not to spread it, so others who have lesser immune system, their immune systems are poorer. They might be more susceptible to being hospitalized because of it. Then we who have stronger immunities, we take precautions because we love our neighbor. We don't take our circumstances lightly. We do not fear unto despair, but we do not take our circumstances lightly. We should not fear our circumstances, as unbelievers do, but we should not take our circumstances lightly. We should be both courageous and empathetic, fearless and compassionate. While as Christians we have a hope that is immovable. Right? We have that anchor. It is immovable. A hope of eternal life that many others in this world do not have that hope. And it is the reason that we don't take our circumstances lightly. Because though our anchor may hold, theirs will not. Without the gospel, their death will mean everlasting punishment, while ours will mean everlasting life. Theirs will mean everlasting punishment. While death is not new, death is not novel, it's times like these that everyone on earth is reminded of the inevitability of death. It is things like this that remind every single one of us, Christian or not, of the inevitability of death. To be reminded of this is a great mercy of God. It's important for us as Christians. We see that. It is a great mercy of God to be reminded of the inevitability of death. And I say this gently. With great trepidation, many have asked why our town over the last 12 months has been hit so hard by death. Why? Why us? As if it were in some sense out of the ordinary or strange. But I tell you that God is merciful to remind us that our sin leads to death. It is a merciful thing that God has reminded us that our sin leads to death. And it's during times like these that we must make every effort to share the gospel with others. To tell people that there is hope. Hope of eternal life, hope of reconciliation with God, if only they would turn away from their sin and trust in God's Son, Jesus, for salvation, that He would forgive them their sin. And as I close, I found these words in John 11:25 particularly appropriate here when Jesus is talking to Martha after his friend Lazarus has died. This is the story, of course, where we read where Jesus wept, right? The smallest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. And why did he weep? He wept, he mourned, because death is not a light thing. For Jesus himself would die so that he might overcome death and that we might not have to die. And so in John 11:25, while he's talking to Martha, after his friend Lazarus has died, he says to her this. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. And he says to her, do you believe this? That's the question for us. That's the question for anyone who's listening or watching. Do you believe this? Martha says to him, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who is coming into the world. Let's pray. Lord, I pray especially for your people who especially may struggle with fear, struggle with daily anxieties about things that they know they shouldn't, that they don't want to fear these things. Lord, my hope is that they would remind themselves every day, that we would remind ourselves every day of your loving care, that we might have a heavenly perspective of our earthly circumstances, no matter how dire those circumstances are. Lord, I pray that we would cast all of our cares on you by prayer and supplication, that every time we worry, every time we're fearful, Lord, that we run to you in prayer, that we are constantly casting our cares upon you, knowing full well that you care for us. Lord, if you're willing to send your only Son to die on our behalf, Lord, what can separate us from the love of Christ? Nothing. There's no famine, there's no plague, there's no sword, there's no persecution, there's nothing that can separate us from your love. Lord, let us remember that. Let us hold on to that. And for those of us who may be tempted to be cavalier in our circumstances, knowing how strong of an anchor we have in you, Lord, let's not be cavalier about our circumstances. Let us not only be courageous, let us be empathetic. Let us be compassionate, taking precautions that we know we don't necessarily have to make. To live is gain, or to live as Christ and to die is gain. We get it. But Lord, let us have compassion on our neighbor by taking steps that may be wise for us, whether that's canceling a vacation or not meeting together as often as we normally would, or shaking a hand, or Lord, it's different for all of us. Lord, there is no cookie cutter answer for each of us in our lives. Our circumstances are different, but help us to be balanced. Help us to be courageous on one hand, but on the other hand, help us to be compassionate. As Albert said earlier, to be motivated by love. Lord, so that we might have joy, that we might not be anxious about anything, and that we might glorify your name in this world. That we might share the gospel with others who do not have hope of life after death. I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
We hope that you have been encouraged and blessed through the preaching of God's Word. If you have questions about how you can have this hope and assurance that is available through the good news of salvation through faith in Jesus Christ, or if you have questions about our local church, or if you have need of help or assistance during this time of uncertainty and crisis, please contact us at unalaskareformed@gmail.com or visit us on the web at unalaskareformed.org.